Actually, just to one of the good questions that we got during our Bible study Tuesday was Bonnie brought up the verse in Revelation chapter 12 that talks about when Satan that John records saying there is a war in heaven and the dragon swept away a third of the stars with his tail. When you read that, it sounds like it was all like one event. And I think, so as I'm looking at it, there are different interpretations of it. So one of them is, as you look in Revelation 12, you'll see that he says, I saw a sign in heaven, and it was a woman with the sun and something, I can't remember how it goes. But so because he says, I saw a sign in heaven, a lot of commentators believe that it is like a celestial event. And some have actually figured out when this celestial event happened, because they're talking about, anyway, it's a long story. So anyway, and to figure out when they think that this had happened, they have computer programs to show you when all this would have lined up. And weirdly enough, they're saying that would have happened on September 11th. And that would have been actually Jesus' birth. So kind of odd that date happens. And then he goes on to say, then there is another sign in heaven, and the dragon swept away a third of the stars with his tails. So a lot of them think that this is also not really telling the story, but showing a celestial event in the skies. So that's one thought. The other one is that if you do think of it as God telling the story of how Satan fell and took his angels with him, that if you took it kind of literally in sequence, then you would have to believe that fall happened during Jesus' birth. But the biblical story doesn't make it seem that way. So you'd have to understand, looking at Revelation, if it's not a celestial event, then that it is and I'm meaning physical celestial stars, alignments and stuff, then it is a story that John is putting together, but he's putting lots of events near the same time. So, so like I normally tell Bonnie or others, I know that may not have answered your question, but what that tells me is just because Revelation 12 says that doesn't mean that it all happened right then, because we know chronologically, even in the biblical story, it all didn't happen at Christ's birth. So anyway, let that settle with you. Because the weird thing is what we're talking about. We're talking today about the second rebellion. Okay, so you're like, oh, wait, I thought that was just all happened at once. And actually, I had always kind of thought that this all had happened prior to the fall of man. But if we get all of that we were taught out of our head and just look at the biblical text, the Bible has a different story. So you have to look at it that the first question is that we looked at, the first part of the series, we looked at that God created this heavenly council of spiritual beings even before we were created. We looked at the Psalms, how the sons of God rejoiced at the creation, and then how he made Eden and made that his home on earth, and it was also part of his counsel, so that when he creates Adam and Eve, that it is welcoming them into that counsel of expanding Eden and making the world a great place and all that. So, and he uses words like for Adam and Eve to rule and stuff like that. So you have that idea that is what's happening. So then in the second sermon of that series, these are all on YouTube and Facebook, we looked at that one guardian cherub that that is Satan, and that he was made to actually guard the tree, but instead he offered it to Adam and Eve, which we don't normally get that out of the text originally, but when you look at it in other ancient Near Eastern texts, you realize, oh, these divine creatures that are half animal and half human, they are not only our divine throne guardians, but they also guard sacred objects. And one of those sacred objects that ancient Near Eastern literature has these cherubs guarding is trees, sacred trees. And so somebody at that time would have read it and said, oh yeah, that cherub was supposed to, because you learn in Ezekiel 30, is it 38 or 28, or can't remember now, that he was a guardian cherub. Well, what was he guarding? Well, they would have known it was the tree. But instead of guarding it, he offered it to Adam and Eve. And that was part of, he's putting dissension now into humanity to begin to doubt and everything. So we looked at that, but that's just only one being that has fallen. And we looked at trying to make this a little practical. A lot of this geekiness is interesting information, but what is the real thing? And we looked at last week, according to 1 John, he teaches us that what true spiritual warfare isn't maybe what you might think. And what he teaches us is, because it's a conflict between two kingdoms, to do the right thing and being obedient to our king, that is spiritual warfare. Right. So when you do the right thing and you choose to love, you choose to forgive, you choose to follow Jesus, that is spiritual warfare. Yeah. So we get this idea that maybe spiritual warfare is these, if I can say the right things to the devil to make him upset or something. No, it is when you do the right thing, because he wants to deceive you into making poor choices and to take rather than to give, and to redefine good and evil for your own self rather than reflecting on what God says about this. So now we're on the third. Then I think there's only one more sermon after this, if I'm still pastor here. So anyway, so admittedly, this is weird stuff, but so I'm hoping I'm going to get this in, and then at the very end give you some application, okay? Because this is all interesting information, but what does this really mean to me and my life, right? So that's what I'm interested in too. So Genesis chapter 6, we're looking at giant problems, the second rebellion. So Genesis chapter 6, and you may have known from the last time a couple years ago when we went through Genesis, I went more in depth, so I'm not, so we may spend a little bit on a question and answer at some point. So think of the questions that you have, and so anyway, Genesis 6. So when human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years." So, looking at what this means as the sons of God, there's a lot of interpretation that think maybe they're the line of Seth, although Sethites are never called sons of God. Some interpretations is kings married, and it was the practice of polygamy, and so. But there's a lot of things that are weird that it doesn't answer, and I'm going to eventually lead you to some to what Jude says and what Peter says, because they have a very different take, which I'm going to share with you right now. So these are, as we talked about in the first of the sermon series, the sons of God are these spiritual heavenly beings. Okay, now when I say spiritual, that don't mean they're like Casper the ghost floating around. We know that spirit beings have bodies too, right? Because when God visited Abraham and God was with two other heavenly beings, they were very physical. They sat and they ate a meal with Abraham. Remember when Jacob wrestled with the angel? He wasn't wrestling with Casper the ghost. It was even though these are heavenly beings, they're also very physical. So you'd think, all right, so that answers the question how angels or these spirit beings could actually come and take wives for themselves. That's still really weird, right? So why did Jesus say in Matthew 22 that, Jesus said, the angels neither marry nor are given in marriage. Well, he didn't say that they didn't, though, or that they can't. He just said that they don't. And the reason why you'll find out soon is because the judgment that was upon those that had. So, weirdness, and it's going to get a little weirder before we end, okay? And I think Scott has already me out on this. So anyway, so Jude, this is what Jude says. This is Jesus' half-brother. It says this. This is what Jude believes. He says, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling. So he's making this accusation of this second rebellion. These angels have left their proper dwelling. They have left their own positions of authority. We're going to find out more what they did in a minute, but he said, what has happened to these that did this? That they are kept in eternal change under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. So these spirit beings that have fallen and have committed such acts, they are not demons. They are in hell, reserved for judgment, okay? So this is, and then he says, kept in eternal chains of under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day, just as, and so he talks about, in now comparison to other sexual sins, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire. That word unnatural desire is strange flesh. So they did that through homosexuality. Now and it's a comparison between the strange flesh of angelic beings and human beings being together. And so says that they serve then as an example of ongoing punishment of eternal fire. So their sin was, still he's connecting it with the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah and having these unnatural desires, leaving their proper dwelling, and so then, and their judgment is important too, that they are forever judged, bound eternity. So you're not messing with these angels, okay? All right. 2 Peter 2 then says, and he's one of Jesus' closest disciples, said this, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, see, that's the same group, so they're in hell, so you don't have to worry about this weird group of angels, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness, and to be kept until the judgment. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah. All right, so he's going through a sequence now of events. So he's talking about Noah right before. He's talking about these fallen angels. Well, when did that happen? Well, that happened before the flood, as he's talking about in Noah. So you're talking about Genesis 6. So, and read. I almost didn't have this all up there, but I'll read it since I have it all up. Noah, who was a herald of righteousness with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. If by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, now he's relating again to the sexual sins in Sodom and Gomorrah, to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. So these are all examples. The angels that didn't stay within their own boundaries, humans didn't stay within their own boundaries with each other, instead having homosexual relationships. And then he says, and he rescued Lot, righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for that the righteous man lived among them day after day. He was tormenting his righteous soul over the lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passions and despise authority. So you get the idea. Again, it's the whole issue of despising authority, defiling passions, and stuff like this. So that they're making reference to. So to me, it seems pretty clear that at least James and Peter seem to believe that this is all some weird thing that's happened with these fallen angels and humanity. The book of First Enoch is, I think, mainly starting with chapter 6, is all about more detail about this. Of course, Enoch didn't write the book of Enoch. It's a apocryphal piece of literature, and it's kind of them I think trying to make sense of what happened in Genesis 6, it goes in a lot more detail. So, but I don't know if all that's inspired or not, but that's what at least that's what they were thinking, okay? And it seems like Jude even draws and actually quotes from First Enoch in that section talking that we just read. So another couple of verses just to talk about these fallen spiritual beings. Job 4 says, "Can mortal man be right before God, and can a man be pure before his Maker? Even in his servants he puts no trust, and his angels he charges with error." Speaking of what has happened here. Job 15 says, "What is man? What is man that he can be pure, or he who is born of a woman that he can be righteous? Behold, God puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in his sight." Speaking of all of this. So, all right, so let's go back to Genesis chapter 6, where we left off before, after the sons of God came to the daughters of humanity. Genesis 6, chapter 6, verse 4 says this, that the Nephilim were in the earth on those days and also afterwards. Pay attention to that. It says the Nephilim were in the earth in those days, speaking of the time before the flood. And then he says, and also afterwards, because you're going to get these Nephilim later in history, even after the flood. Okay? When the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them, and they were heroes. That word could also be translated tyrant warriors. Okay? So they were heroes in Mesopotamia, which I'll get to in a minute. Men of renown, heroes of old. So, okay, what is the Nephilim? So these angelic beings had intercourse with women, human women, and produced the Nephilim. What are Nephilim? So the Bible most often translates it giants, as they should. Now, we're not thinking like Jolly Green Giant, ho, 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 with his can of peas or green beans or whatever he has. So we're thinking of, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that the Bible that Jesus would have read, basically, if it wasn't in Hebrew, it would have been the Septuagint. And you can tell the New Testament writers refer to it a lot because they quote it all the time in their epistles and their letters. That translation gives giants the height of 6 feet 6 inches. Okay, that's not bad. I mean, if the normal height of a Jewish person was 5 foot, 5'3" or something like that, so 6.5 feet would be pretty tall. The Masoretic text that is translated later gives more of a height of around 9 feet 9 inches. So, and that doesn't sound like, maybe that doesn't sound tall to you, but that's huge. Yeah. You need to look up Robert Wadlow, who was born in Alton, Illinois. He was just a half an inch or just a smidgen, just under 9 feet tall. And this guy towers over everybody when you see the picture. It is frighteningly tall. And it's because his pituitary gland didn't quit working. But anyway, and he died at age 21 and he was still growing. So it was just crazy. So look, that's one of your assignments, look up Robert Wadlow. Yeah, it actually has pictures of him. He would carry his father, who was the mayor of Alton, Illinois, up the steps. And his dad looks like a child in his arms. That's just weird. Yeah, it's crazy. Crazy stuff. Anyway, so the Nephilim, and to help make some connections here, in Deuteronomy chapters 1, 2, and 3, and in Amos 2, the Nephilim are also referred to as, in other words, okay, as the Anakim, the Ammonite, and the Rephaim, okay? And they are called also descendants of the Nephilim, okay? So you have this bloodline of these very big people. And it makes sense. I mean, if you're going to mix up some like celestial being and some human being, you're going to get something weird. And oddly enough, that other cultures have these same stories of of like the Titans, or Hercules was half god. His dad was a god, his mother was a human, and stuff like that. So you have these stories. And you have these stories all throughout ancient Mesopotamian literature in the ancient Near East. And these Nephilim were the ones that they give credit to building this great Mesopotamian culture. And so they are heroes in the eyes of the Mesopotamians and Babylonians. They see them as great heroes of their day. You might have heard of Gilgamesh. He is one of the kings of early Babylon, and they describe him as being a descendant of the Nephilim. So if you read Enoch, the first Enoch, it like Genesis 6 is telling a different story. It's not saying that these Nephilim were great for humanity. It says that they were about the destruction of humanity because they were teaching humankind about warfare. They were teaching them about the different potions and sorcery and stuff, and leading humanity astray. So Genesis 6 wants you to know, though, that these are not great heroes and people that are great things. It's not a good thing. It's leads to the destruction of humanity. So when we read earlier that it says, and that they had that they existed, not that this happened not only in those days but also afterwards. Remember in Genesis 6. So you get that this also. The flood was to destroy all this mess, okay? Because it was getting really complicated now that these fallen beings did this. So God was going to have to destroy it all and start all over again. However, it says that this happened also afterwards, and you read as Israel goes to conquer these other lands, there are giants, these Nephilim, descendants of the Nephilim. Well, how did they get there? Did they sneak on the boat or what? No, the implication is that the other angels still were falling and still were committing these acts. So that's the disturbing part, that it just didn't all happen at once, that it evidently had to happen again according to the way the biblical narrative is. And that's what they want you to think. So anyway, and there's a lot more discussion in that. I can give you some really good detail on some scholarly stuff if you're interested. You can really geek out on this. So and actually Paul, the Apostle Paul, you'll find in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the Apostle Paul is still concerned about angels falling, because he says, women, now you should wear long hair for the sake of the angels. What is he talking about? So evidently he's still concerned that something could happen even in this spiritual realm. So now I'm getting you to the conquest of Canaan. Did it ever seem unfair to you that God would have them destroy entire cities and not leave one person standing? This is when you're reading this, I just thought it was like every city they did this to, but it's not. Obviously, it's not, because they had many of them that they brought in and made as woodcutters and stuff like that, okay? So, and they became temptations later because they didn't deal with it all. But, so they had certain cities that were devoted to destruction, and these cities, if you look at in Judges, that were devoted to destruction were these cities where the Anakim and the Ammonites, descendants of the Nephilim, were. So what they're trying to do is eradicate this half human, half angelic being that they're trying. But you don't really notice that unless you really start looking at it. It says Joshua 11. I think I have that here. Joshua 11, next slide. Yep. And Joshua came at that time and he cut off the Anakim. Remember in Deuteronomy 1 through 3 and Amos 2, that's another word for these Nephilim. That Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron to Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah and from the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction and their cities. And there was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. And that's supposed to set you up thinking, oh, wait a minute. I've read this before.
Right.
What was in Ashdod and Gath? What great hero came out of that? Goliath, right? So it's supposed to set you up seeing that, okay, they're all killed, but we're going to tell you more about the final destruction in the next narratives that come ahead. So it leads you to the Goliath and everything. So, all right, now this is the weird thing that I'm going to throw at you, okay? I've always, you thought that was weird, okay? All right. So we know that these angels that committed such horrible acts, they are already judged. They are in hell. So what are we dealing with in the New Testament with demons? If the only rebellious spiritual being is Satan. Well, according to New Testament, not New Testament, but the Second Temple literature, they go on and explain how when one of these giants die, that because they are half angelic and half human, that they are the demons that we're dealing with. Isn't that weird? So that's, yeah. You know, if you still want to believe they're fallen angels, that's fine. I'm not gonna. But the interesting thing, as far as when you look into the New Testament, there are a lot of different things that the New Testament calls demons. 8 times they call them evil spirits, but the most common thing they call them is unclean or impure spirits, and that is because they are a mixture of angelic and human. And that term comes from First Enoch, is what they're drawing from, because that's the term that they use for these spirits that come. So what we're dealing with when we're dealing with demonic spirits here on earth isn't so much a fallen angel, but these giants, Nephilim, that were produced, that had died, who are neither fully human or nearly human, nearly not all angelic, but they are the beings that are left behind that we're having to deal with. All right, so that's weird. Okay, I admit that's weird. So we'll go on. So now I'm getting to the end, and we're getting near to application, because this is all interesting, weird stuff to know, but what good is it? So anyway, when Jesus shows up in the New Testament, in the narrative of the New Testament, Jesus is now casting out demons and doing all these crazy things, right? He's out there and he's casting out demons. And to somebody in that New Testament time that would have surprised them is Jesus is not summoning some higher power than himself. And that he's not using any kind of incantations. He's not using any ashes, no potions. He's just doing it in his own authority.
Right.
So what we're supposed to realize as we read the New Testament is Jesus is the divine Son of God who has all authority over these beings.
Right.
And he needs no other greater authority than himself to do this. And so that would have been a big sign to a New Testament reader, like, holy cow, you mean Jesus is doing this on his own? You know? And so the New Testament writers want to really make sure you get this, that it is Jesus that's doing this. And he commissions his disciples to do this in what? In his name. Because his name is... So, after we've went through all this weird stuff, we don't have to be afraid of any of these spirits, unclean spirits, right? Because Jesus has all authority and he's given us authority. The Bible says, greater is he that is in me, right? Than he that is in the world. So you don't have to worry about them, doing anything detrimental to you or anything like that. So we have authority. Now they can mess with you, that we're going to read here in a second. But Luke chapter 9, Jesus gives us full authority over demonic spirits. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 says also that we are God's temple. And so we can't be inhabited by any other spirit being, any demon or anything. So you're not going to get possessed. If you trust in Jesus, you have Christ in you, you you have God himself dwelling on the inside of you. So Christians cannot be demon possessed. Okay? So there you go. So last verse and some better application. Now you would think that when you're in spiritual warfare, there would be some cool stuff, like at least a sword or something, a shield. You know, you get all these cool pictures of fighting the devil, fighting the dragon. Well, Paul doesn't want to disappoint you, so he paints this picture for you, but he explains what the sword and the shield and all this cool stuff is. So in Ephesians 6, he says this. Finally, that's a good way to close a sermon. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God. Why? Why do we need the full armor of God? So that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. Because he's going to mess with you. And all these spirit beings are meant for the destruction of humanity. Let me say this, though. You don't always think that it's the devil or these demons tempting you to do wrong. James says that we get enticed when we are carried away from what? Our own lusts. So don't just blame everything on the devil. Don't do a Flip Wilson. Half of you don't know who that is. But sometimes it's just because, you know, I'm making poor choices. You know, I've got choices in front of me and I'm dragged away by my own lusts. So, but anyway, they do have schemes. They do have a plan. They want to mess you up. If they know that your biggest issue is feeling disappointed, if they think that you're going to be crippled doing kingdom work because you're disappointed, they're going to throw disappointment at you all the time. Right. If they think that they can cripple you because you have a tendency of being apathetic and not really speaking up or doing the things you know you should do, but it's just comfortable for you to just sit there and be quiet, then apathy is just going to keep, they're going to keep figuring out how can they bring apathy upon you, okay? They don't want you extending Eden and doing good things. If you are paralyzed by doing anything because you feel very insecure, they know this. They've watched you grow up. And so they're going to throw insecurities at you. I think it's good for you to recognize what your hang-up is. Right. Because when that starts happening, you're like, you know, this is an attack of the enemy. Right. And so then he tells you what you need to do. So for our struggle, he said, you know, our struggle isn't against one another. We've looked at this before. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood and against rulers, but it's against the rulers, against authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. I think it's interesting that he tells you to stand. It's almost in opposition to what when David fought the Nephilim in his day. Everybody was running away, being apathetic, not wanting to fight. And here he gives this picture of when he says, you need to stand. You know, just like David went against this Nephilim, you need to go against these Nephilim unclean spirits by standing up too. You don't shrink back, so you stand. And so, but this is what you wear. I know you'd like to wear a breastplate and all this other cool stuff and take a slice of the enemy and stuff like this. But here's what your armor is, okay? He says, with your belt of truth buckled around your waist. Live a life of truth. Be true to what you're living, what you believe in. You know, live by truth. You don't have to be outwardly one person and inwardly somebody else. You need to just live truthfully and live by God's principles of what truth really is. And so we don't think of this as spiritual warfare, but living a very authentic life in the life of Jesus, that is spiritual warfare. So have that truth about you. It doesn't mean like you got to tell the truth all the time. I mean, if you think, you know, Pastor Ken is I don't know, maybe needs to grow his hair out a little longer or something, but you just tell him that yes, he looks nice. That's not lying, okay? So lying is is about when it's being deceitful, it's being harmful. So tell me I look good every time. Truth buckled around your waist with the breastplate of righteousness, that we live in a way that is right. Positionally, we are right before God, that we don't have to do anything. But we are to live in a right way between God and man. And then so that is spiritual warfare. Living rightly, doing the right thing. This is spiritual warfare. Okay? So very practical things. And then with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. We're going to talk about that more next Sunday. But it's about even having the gospel, the good news that creates peace. How many know that the world needs peace today? Okay? And it's the gospel that's going to do it. It's not going to be Trump or Biden. So it's going to be Jesus. It's going to be the good news. So in addition to all this, he said, take up the shield of faith. And he calls it the shield of faith. It's trusting God. Spiritual warfare is about trusting God. Adam and Eve didn't trust God, right? They took of the fruit. They decided to do their own thing. They decided to define good and evil on their own. But you just need to trust God to do the right thing. This is spiritual warfare. There's two kingdoms at work here, fighting against one another. You need to side with the right kingdom. And so the shield of faith, which you extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. So you've got this idea that they're on attack. They're throwing things at you. And what you need to do, you just need to trust God. If you're feeling very apathetic, trust God and get out of your apathy. If you're feeling very self-conscious or just self-defeated or anything like that, then you just trust God that, yes, my sins are forgiven. I can go on and do great things for God, no matter what the enemy tells me. So we go through it like this. So, and take the helmet of salvation. Of course, we have, we've given our lives to Christ. We're saved. We're in Him. And the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, that we know that we can combat the enemy with God's Word, just as Jesus did in the wilderness, as when He was tempted in the wilderness and was against Satan. Jesus used God's Word. And then he says this is more familiar to us Pentecostals and Charismatics, and pray in the Spirit. So prayer is a part of spiritual warfare because you're making things happen. You're in this counsel with God to changing the world around us and our community. So pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers. All kinds of prayers, all kinds of requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. So especially be praying for one another. Right. And then he goes on to say, and especially pray for me as I do God's work, implying praying for those who have given themselves to like missionaries like Elisa and others that have gone out into the world. So, all right. And remember when Jesus said to his disciples they couldn't cast out a demon, and he said, well, this doesn't come out but by what? Prayer and fasting. So prayer and fasting. So these are our tools that we use. So as you want to become paralyzed, and see, I struggle with seasonal depression. So I like to be a busybody doing things, and when it gets cold, I just want to huddle in and put the cover on and just wake me up when it's over, okay? So and because I know that, I've got to go into this winter season knowing I've got to be more prepared, more on my feet than usual, because Satan's really going to want to make me lazy this winter. So I got to be on it, So you got to know these things. So, but anyway, so that was not a very classy conclusion, but that's what real spiritual warfare is. Right. I think, I kind of snicker at people that aren't Christians and they look for other means in paganism and Wicca and other things to try to control spirits and control things. And they're just playing around. I mean, they're not really effectively doing anything. except stirring things up that they should be stirring up, But if you really want to do some work that affects the spiritual world, you'll do the right thing. You'll follow Jesus. You're going to pray. You're going to do all these things that Paul suggests. So Peggy would come. So yeah, Stranger Things. Yes, it's going to get stranger next week. You thought this one was a weird one. So next week is a weirder one.